Welcome back, casual gardeners. This is why you don't want to do a lot of planting in the rain, but I put off my bulbs too long and it's going to snow tonight, so this is what I look like now. This is my life. Let's talk about this one's not so bad, 5 bulbs you can plant in the fall. These are the most common ones, so probably you're interested. We're doing tulips. I've got some Triumph Tulip Flaming Flag. So these are my tulips. They're going to be a bright red. I really like bright red tulips. Daffodils. Fragrant Jonquil Daffodil. Narcissus Jonquilla Quail. Crocuses, Alliums, and Hyacinths. That's the other one. Mixed hyacinths. I really like a mix of colors. Before I get down to specifics, let's talk about some things that are generally true for all of these bulbs, because one cool thing about fall planted bulbs is that they do have a lot in common. So perhaps the most important detail about fall planted bulbs is that they all have a period of cold dormancy that in most cases is necessary for them to grow the following year. I know tulips need 12 to 14 weeks of temperatures below 55 degrees Fahrenheit, or else they just will not grow. So if you're living in zones 8 or above and you're growing tulips, either you're going to have to treat them as an annual, or you will need to dig them up and then refrigerate them over the winter and then plant them again in the spring. Sounds like a giant pain in the tuchus. It makes me glad. It's one of the few things that make me glad I am planting out in zone 6A, where I can just put my bulbs in the ground and then leave them there and ignore them, and it's just right. So if you're planting zones 3 to 8, most of these fall planted zones can be left in the ground as regular perennials, and it's great. Another thing they all have in common is that their leaves are going to be out there creating energy stores for next year's flower after the blooms have faded. So what you're going to want to do with all of these is you are going to want to leave them alone until they have died completely down to the ground and then clean them up. I know some people like a tidy garden, and those people are probably just really annoyed by this hand right now. Also with alliums, unless it is a self-sterile cultivar of allium, you're going to want to cut off the flower stalk once its bloom has faded, because otherwise it will self-seed all over your garden. And that sounds nice. You're like, yes, more alliums for free, sign me up. And kind of it is. But I mean, we're talking hundreds of seeds, and I did it, and the allium seedlings were so dense they looked like lawn, is what we're talking about. It's too much. So unless you've got like a big wild area and you're just like, go crazy alliums, it really is a good thing to control them a little bit. Now, another thing all of these bulbs have in common is that you can cover them over with mulch if you want to. You may find that mulching over your bulbs after you've planted them helps keep the squirrels off of them, or other things that might otherwise dig them up and eat them, in which case you should definitely do it. The only downside to mulch is that it may delay them coming up a little bit in the spring, because the mulch keeps the soil cool a little bit longer. So just keep that in mind. All of these fall planted bulbs are going to do best in full sun and in freely draining soil. I have clay soil, so I'm planting in a raised bed. You can also plant them in pots, in potting soil. They will do okay in part sun. If you have some dappled shade you want to sow them in, all of these will do fine there as well. But they really do like a bit of full sun. And then in the summer when things are too hot, they've gone to sleep and they're just out of the picture. Another thing to keep in mind is that you should not get super nervous about your planting time. It's recommended to plant most of these 4 to 6 weeks before the first hard frost, because it gives you a little bit of time for root development before the cold just shuts everything down. But that's not 100% necessary. I transplanted some alliums this summer, and of course they didn't come up because it wasn't the right time. They didn't have that period of cold to let them know that it was a new year. And so they just sat dormant in my soil, and they're going to come up next spring. So if you find yourself planting your bulbs late, like I'm doing right now, as long as you can get them in your soil to a reasonable depth, and you can water them in, or today it's raining, so I'm not going to do that. As long as you can do that, they'll be fine. You don't have to really sweat the spacing and the depth. These are recommendations for optimal growth. If you plant them a little too shallow or a little too deep, or on their side because you couldn't tell which end was the pointy end and needs to go up, they're gonna be okay. In fact, a lot of these have specialized roots that they'll grow to just kind of tug the bulb into a more ideal position. It's not common to all of these fall planted bulbs, and I don't remember specifically which ones they are, but my experience has been that you can be a pretty slapdash planter with your bulbs. You don't need to bust out an actual ruler. Take a deep breath and just get them in the ground. Now, one thing I have noticed that's really important to me is that if you scatter them and just plant them willy-nilly through a large area, they're going to appear washed out and just kind of disappear into your garden when they bloom. Usually I would say plant your flowers in clusters or drifts because you're going to get a higher visual impact. Some of the larger alliums actually are a lot of fun just as individual specimens coming out of a planting. But in most cases, like these red tulips I planted today, they're going to look so much more striking in a cluster or a clump or a drift than they would planted out interspersed among a bunch of other stuff, because that red is just going to pop. Let's talk about daffodils. You're going to want to plant your daffodils 6 to 8 inches deep, and you're going to want to space them at least 4 to 6 inches apart. And these are strongly naturalizing, so you will see more and more daffodils year after year if your climate is right for them. The thing about daffodils is that they do not like nitrogen. If you fertilize your daffodils, use a low or no nitrogen fertilizer, because they're really sensitive to it. They'll burn from it quite easily. So most of these bulbs, I will say, use a balanced fertilizer. With daffodils, use a very unbalanced nitrogen poor fertilizer. And these, if you want to fertilize them, I've never fertilized them and they've always come up the same size year after year. If you do need to fertilize them, use a slow release fertilizer and apply it to the top of the soil after you've planted them. You do not need to put fertilizer down in the hole with them. In fact, in most cases, it is ideal not to. As far as tulips, we're looking at a planting depth of 4 to 6 inches. In clay soils, go no deeper than 6 inches because they are more likely to rot because the drainage is worse. In sandy soils, you can actually go as deep as 8 inches and they'll be fine. And you're going to want to space them at about 4 to 6 inches apart. If you want to fertilize them, again, don't put it down the hole. Apply a balanced fertilizer on top of the soil, either in the fall after you've planted them, or in the spring, you can top dress as they've started coming up. Hyacinths are another one that I've never fertilized, and they just come back year after year with big, beautiful flowers that are so big that they tend to fall over under their own weight. So hyacinths, again, that's a balanced fertilizer if you must. Apply it in the fall or the spring as they start to come up on top of the soil, not down the hole. You're going to plant hyacinths 4 to 6 inches deep and space them about 5 or 6 inches apart. And these are really big bulbs, which should tell you to give them a little bit more room. You're not going to see me planting any crocus, but crocuses, if you're planting them, can go quite a bit shallower. You're only going to be planting crocuses 3 to 6 inches deep Again, a lot of that is going to depend on the bulb size and the type of soil. Plant shallower in clay soils, plant deeper if your bulbs are bigger or your soil is sandier. And crocuses you can space as close as 3 or 4 inches apart and they'll be fine. It's especially important with crocuses to plant them in clumps because they will just disappear if you don't. Their flowers are small, their leaves are small. They're a beautiful early blooming flower, but they're better in clumps. And if you must fertilize them very little, either in the fall or in the spring. And finally, with alliums, you won't see me plant any, even though I transplanted a bunch of them over the summer from other locations where I didn't want them. Alliums are going to be fertilized with a balanced fertilizer as needed, and they really like the phosphorus. So if you live in a place where your soil is poor in phosphorus, make sure it's a high phosphate fertilizer. Utah soils are generally naturally high in phosphorus, and so I would just use a balanced fertilizer if I fertilize them at all. But again, onions are something that usually the nutrients they get from a top dressing with compost are sufficient to just keep them going year after year. These are going to be planted 4 to 8 inches deep and space them at least 6 to 8 inches apart. These are larger bulbs and larger flowers and broader, strappier leaves than most of the other fall planted bulbs, so you need to allow them a lot more space. Those were the 5 bulbs that you can plant in the fall, and aside from crocuses, now I have 4 out of 5 of them in that bed. So that's going to be a feast for the eyes in the spring. So what is your favorite bulb? And do you have any special tips for planting it that I may have missed? Let me know in the comments. And thank you for joining me in my garden today. I hope you have a wonderful time in your own.